Hi, name is Ravi Kalaichelvan from Pembani Remgro Infrastructure Fund. We we are we've just had first. I mean, we had first close last year, and we intend to have our final closing in about 2 months' time. We're an infrastructure fund, an equity infrastructure fund. Our playground is really Africa. We we're into all infrastructure and a little bit beyond infrastructure. I'm sure I'll be asked to talk about some of our assets. So Africa, and not just Sub-Saharan Africa. I think we'll look at Africa itself. We're interested in all traditional forms of infrastructure, from ports to terminals to road concessions to rail concessions, and anything that has some inkling of infrastructure. We're very interested in doing brownfield transactions, greenfield transactions, and we have an interest to do buy into operating entities that have an infrastructure angle. I'll give more examples on that a bit later. Thanks.
And then moving on to Ravi. Ravi, if you've already introduced who Pembani is, but if you could kindly share your investment strategy and probably appetite and your pipeline of projects on the continent currently.
Thanks. On our investment strategy, I think it's best to look back how we structured this fund. When we sat down and said, okay, what are we going to do with this fund? We said infrastructure. Okay, that's great. So we would then look at all your your traditional stuff, your power, your road concessions, and your terminals and ports. That's great. That's fantastic. How can we be a little different? Because we realized, look, there is potentially enough cash out there. We need to invest, and we had to sit down and think, how do we differentiate ourselves? So we had to create a bigger investment universe for ourselves. And what we said was, okay, we'll do all the traditional stuff. We'll do the greenfield stuff. We'll do the brownfield. That's fantastic. But let's also think about investing in operating entities, more of PE transactions that have a infrastructure angle to it. So, it's a very, I think the definition of infrastructure is getting assaulted every day. It's a simple example. I mean, growing up, I never thought I'll see the day, but, out there, you see a proliferation of entities going and selling standalone solar panels to homes across Africa. Okay, now, originally you would think this is selling of power. You would need the national utility of the country to come in and provide that power. Guess what? We're getting into the FMCG space now. And it's fascinating to see that, there's a shift in that definition of infrastructure, because FMCG is coming in to this space that we were all so comfortable about. So it's fascinating to see what's out there. So, but let's talk about a bit of our transactions. Our first transaction was, wait for it, an agri trading processing entity in Dar es Salaam. What does it do? It collects commodities from your subsistence farmers, aggregates them, takes them through the aggregation centers, to the warehouses, to the ports, takes the commodities straight to destination markets, and uses the same warehousing aggregation infrastructure from there, buys up fertilizers, uses the chain of infrastructure, and sells it off to the farmers. So it's bidirectional. And we looked at this and we said, look, someone's going to say this is agri, right? okay, everyone in the room says, what's an infrastructure fund doing in the agri space? Well, we thought, let's look at it differently. This is actually infrastructure. There is a network of underlying logistical infrastructure that is underpinning this business. And we as a fund with an infrastructure view, it's easy to legitimize. And that's what we did. So, and the next one we looked at was let's start off by saying rail, transport, rail. You've got rail concessions, you've got, there's such a need to rehabilitate, in fact, rail networks on the continent. That's great, that's fantastic, but what are you going to put on it, right? So we started a leasing entity, a rolling stock locomotive leasing entity, actually with Grindrod, who is an OEM manufacturer and provides a servicing arm, a maintenance arm. And what we do is we set up an entity to lease out locomotives to mining houses, railway utilities, and whoever needs it. Because what we found was, I've done trips to some of these countries. They've got 30 locos. Guess what? Only 5 or 6 are actually running, because the rest are supplying parts to these other 5, 6. So there's cannibalization going on, and the guys always say to the guys, well, why don't you buy? What are you doing? We can't afford to buy. We just can't. So that's where the idea came about, to start giving a different angle to this, is to say, here's another different form of financing. You lease the transaction. Lease the locomotives. So I think, we're an infrastructure fund, and what we're trying to look at is trying to look at this infrastructure space a bit differently. I think it's important to look beyond the notion of infrastructure we used to. I talked about the off-grid infrastructure, but looking at, for instance, industrial warehouses. Someone might say, wait a minute, that's property, but that's also infrastructure. That's logistics, and we think the actual one of the biggest drivers from our end, it's actually power and logistics. We're seeing logistics as a great opportunity on this continent. Logistics is what eventually is going to glue up an economy. And and even if there's even a 0% growth rate, there is an underlying economy with inefficiencies that need to be sorted out. And so that's how we see our play, on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, for bringing a different paradigm to infrastructure and stretching sort of the definition of what infrastructure is and challenging all of us. And it's interesting to hear about the innovative ways in which you found the innovative ways in which you stayed within your mandate that you'd been given by investors, but yet you still managed to create opportunities. It's interesting in the way you framed the PV panels as FMCG, and that's the reality. It's here today, gone tomorrow. Exactly. Sold within minutes. And then also interesting is how you've managed to sort of incorporate, and I think it's with the ETG story, incorporating the small industry players into the wider and mainstream economy, as well as the rolling stock opportunity. There are very few. It's a well-developed market in Europe in particular, but on the African continent we're seeing very, very few players. Actually, you're the second of 2 players in South Africa. And the IDC has had the opportunity to be a co-investor in your competitor. Great, thank you for that.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.